back, everybody, to another episode of Making Monsters. I'm Taylor Dahl, and we're continuing on our look, getting to know some of the newest Chicago Bears draft picks. And right now, we're going to talk a little bit Luther Burden. I know a lot of people are excited about Burden. That was kind of, a lot of people didn't think he was going to make it to that next pick that Chicago ended up getting him at. So chatting with me today is Eli Hoff. He's a Missouri beat reporter for St. Louis Post-Dispatch and an insider for KTRS. So Eli, I really appreciate you hopping on with me.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Of course, I know a lot of people are very excited about this Bears offense, a combination of a DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, Luther Burden, Cole Kmet, Colston Loveland. There's a lot of weapons now for Caleb Williams, and we'll see how they all fit together and how they mesh and what Ben Johnson can do with all of them. But I think the start of this is getting to know Luther Burden and his kind of role at Missouri and how that may transfer to the NFL. So let's start there. His freshman year, pretty much out of the gates, he was I think the highest recruited wide receiver that Missouri had ever had. So when those expectations are coming in, I think it is a lot kind of riding on the shoulders at that time. He flashed not a crazy amount of yards, 375, but did have 6 touchdowns that year as a freshman. So talk a little bit about that first year and what you guys saw out of Luther right away coming out of the gates.
Yeah, as you mentioned with Luther, he's someone who came in as a very highly touted recruit, to say the least, and even made more so by the fact that he was a 5-star guy who chose to stay close to home. That just got the hype train going before he even really set foot on campus. Then he came in and had what I would describe as a really intriguing freshman year. Missouri did not have the greatest season overall. There was a lot of inconsistency with quarterback play, and he was a true freshman coming in. And you know, even the most talented true freshmen sometimes have an adjustment period in the SEC. But he showed a lot of potential. He showed a lot of his kind of yards after the catch, ball in his hands, playmaking, some of that. He had his a punt return touchdown his freshman year that was one of the most ill-advised, but turned out to be a great play where the ball bounced before he fielded it, and then he took it to the house. So there was a lot to like that freshman year, but he wasn't by any means the top target that year because he didn't really have to be. It was just that he showed a lot of potential and then continued to build on that from there.
So let's talk about that. I think, was it that year where he had a rushing touchdown, a receiving touchdown, and the punt return touchdown? Was it his freshman year?
Correct. Yep, that was his freshman year.
So that shows a little bit of his versatility, which I do want to talk to you about in a minute. But moving on to that sophomore season, because I think statistically that was his best career season when you look at the numbers and touchdowns and yardage and everything he was able to do that year. Also, it was a Missouri team that had 2 losses, and the only 2 losses were against LSU and Georgia. So it's also against good competition. They battled against LSU when they played them too, and it was a really fun game. I specifically remember watching that game. It was really fun to watch Missouri offense go up against, granted, a bad LSU defense, but still a team that a lot of people thought were going to have a chance at getting to the national championship that year. So talk a little bit about that sophomore season. What changed the most between his freshman year and that sophomore year?
Yeah, there were a couple of things here, and it was part of the broader context, as you kind of alluded to there. Missouri as a whole took a huge step from the 2022 season, which was Burden's freshman year, to the 2023 season, which was his sophomore year. It went from a team that was barely bowl eligible to a team that was beating Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl. So it was a big change across the board for Mizzou. With Luther specifically, he moved from an outside spot into the slot going into his second year, with the thinking being it would be a little bit easier for Mizzou to consistently get the ball in his hands. His build suited that position a little bit more at the next level. So they were already kind of trying to get him ready for this stage of his career, even at that point. And it paid dividends. Over 1,200 yards. He was producing a lot in terms of touchdowns. He showed some verticality. He was showing the playmaking I mentioned earlier, where you get the ball in his hands at any part of the field and he can do something. But he also, one of the bigger developments, I think his sophomore year, was kind of clutch playmaking. There was a game Mizzou had that year against Florida that came down to Mizzou needing to convert a 4th and 17 to stay in the game and end up winning. And it was Luther Burden who got himself open, came down with a pretty tough catch to keep Mizzou in that game, and Mizzou ended up winning. So there was some clutch playmaking that really developed as that year went on, and the statistical output, his volume, that's very much when he emerged on the national radar. He went from this 5-star recruit who had a lot of potential, who a lot of Missouri fans liked, to someone who became one of the best wide receivers in college football. Now, as I'm sure we'll get to in a second here, that kind of regressed a little bit going in his junior year, but that second season was a heck of a year for him.
So you mentioned that moving him to the slot was kind of opened things up for him that season. Do you think that is his best place in the NFL also, if that slot wide receiver?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just given his build, that makes a lot of sense. The ability, he's someone who you can move around in terms of motioning him and jet sweeps. That was always something Mizzou liked to do. You could line him up in the backfield. I think I'd seen going into the draft a lot of comparisons to Debo Samuel.
Okay.
And I'm not sure that's perfect, but I think if that's sort of what you envision for what his best role could be at the NFL, I think that's as good a baseline as we've seen. But again, Ben Johnson's a great offensive mind.
Yeah.
We'll have to see what he comes up with.
Yeah, I feel like we may see some funky things because to that point, I've seen a lot of clips from like as you're watching his film, and there's a lot of plays where he is in the backfield, and I could see Ben Johnson definitely using him in that type of way. I don't know if he's going to pigeonhole him to a slot wide receiver, but I could see him spending a lot of time there. But I do think the combination of DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, and Luther Burden work well because DJ is just kind of that guy that can be all over the place. He can be a deep threat if he needs. He can be in the slot. He can do kind of a little bit of everything. Rome is more that guy, the contested catches, get up, get the ball, 50-50 type of guy. And then Luther can do a lot, but being able to have that true slot receiver, I think helps let DJ and Rome do what they're good at. And obviously Luther's good at that too. So let's talk about that 2024 season, because I think that's what a lot of people are going to point to when you go and you look at a box score and there's the drop off. There was, I think, like about half the amount of yardage, still 6 touchdowns. So you're still seeing him there in the red zone and being an active part in the scoring part of that offense. But tell us a little bit about what happened that season offensively as a whole for Missouri, but also for Luther Burden.
Yeah, this was one that was a surprising regression for both Luther Burden and again the entire Missouri offense coming off such a good 2023 season. He was getting all the hype. At this time last year, we were talking about Luther Burden as a potential top 5, maybe even with the right kind of year, someone who could be going top 3, top 2, top 1 in the draft, someone who was, a fringe Heisman contender, talking Biletnikoff. All of that stuff was what we were talking about a year ago with Luther Burden, and it never amounted to any of that. His, as you mentioned, his receiving yards went from over 1,200 to 650, 670 his junior year. The touchdowns remained up there. He had a couple rushing scores again, but the production and the volume just weren't there on anything approaching the same level. He was still in the same slot position, so nothing really changed there. There was more inconsistency at quarterback. Brady Cook, who was Mizzou's quarterback, just didn't have the same deep ball accuracy that he had in 2023. And then he was injured and missed parts of the tail end of the season. So there was some inconsistency there. Early on in the year, Luther wasn't on the field for the second half of one early game, and he was off the field for some third downs. That was a little strange at times. And then it got to a really weird point in the year where he just wasn't being used a whole lot by Mizzou. There was one game, and now I'm blanking on which one it was from Mizzou, but it was in the middle part of the season where those of us in the press box, we were counting, and it was 30 offensive snaps before Luther Burden got a touch. And he was far and away the best player on this Missouri team. Nobody was doubting that. The coaching staff wasn't doubting that. There just seemed to be a struggle with getting him the ball. And that was bemusing because, as we talked about, he's someone who you can hand the ball off to. You can run a jet sweep for him. You can run a little bubble screen and just get the ball to him. He's a slot guy. They put him there to make it easier to get him the ball, and that didn't happen at times. So again, whether that's on him as a route runner or his availability to be on the field for every snap, if that's on the quarterback for not getting it to him, if that's on the coaching staff for not drawing up those plays, it's probably a combination of all three, but it certainly seemed to contribute to the kind of overall decline in his production last year.
Yeah, we're very familiar with the lack of getting people the ball that you feel like you need to get the ball. There was a lot of moments last year where we were wondering why a Keenan Allen wasn't getting touches or a Cole Kmet wasn't getting touches. And it kind of, there's not really an explanation all the time. To your point, I think it's a combination of a lot of things. Sometimes it's offensive play calling. Sometimes it's just the opponents being able to shut certain people down. And then you have to kind of come up with a backup game plan. But it will, and that's one of the positive things. I know a lot of times people say there's too many mouths to feed now in the Bears offense. I'm fine with Caleb having multiple options, honestly. And so we'll see how Ben Johnson kind of navigates all of that. But I do want to ask you, because some of the concerns through this draft process, some of the draft profiles you read, or maybe some of the things scouts were saying, we're talking more so about his maybe work ethic. They kind of criticized his work ethic in certain areas. Maybe he didn't love football as much as some other players love football. Now, I've seen multiple coaches from Missouri kind of discredit that immediately and not really even pay much attention to that. But what are your thoughts just from the time of covering Luther for these 3 years? Did you ever get a sense of that at all?
Not really, to be honest with you. It had caught me by surprise, just the degree to which he slid in the pre-draft process because of the quote unquote personality things. If folks were going to slide him because of his production, that is what it is. That would have made sense. That caught me a little bit off guard, to be honest with you. He's someone who always got a lot of praise from his coaches, got a lot of praise from his teammates for setting a standard in practice. Again, it comes back, he wasn't necessarily an every down guy in 2024, and maybe that's part of it. Maybe that says something to someone at the next level. Maybe in GMs and scouts meeting with him, something came up there. We don't really get a peek at all of that. He is someone who was option A for this Missouri offense for 2 years. Came in, he had NIL deals, it seemed like, before he even hit campus. His face is on bags of chips all across the state of Missouri. Maybe that contributes to something. I don't know there. It's not something I ever saw in my time covering him, but these things come up for a reason. I guess he slid to the second round because of something.
Do you know, was there ever a thought at all for him that he may stay one more year, or was this always going to be enter the NFL draft this year?
This was always the plan. I think just coming in as the type of recruit he was, and then having a really good second season, it seemed like everyone was on pretty clear terms that year 3 would be the last year for Luther Burden at Missouri. And then if he'd known where he went now, would that have changed? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure how much one more year at Missouri would have really helped him. He would have had a new quarterback anyway. So it seems like getting out as soon as possible and going on to the next level was always the plan.
The best idea. Yeah. And it's a tough decision for some of these guys. We talk about it all the time, because you stay the one more year, and if you regress again or you get injured, that you're risking a lot there. And where it's kind of interesting, like a Carson Beck is going to be a fascinating thing to kind of follow of this, because we were talking about Carson Beck being a top 5 pick a year ago, and then now, well, it's going to be it's going to count a lot of what he's doing down there in Miami. So it is interesting to see what some of these guys choose. A few more for you before I let you go, because I do think you mentioned the Deebo Samuel comp. A few of the draft profiles I've seen have compared him to a person that hasn't quite transferred to the NFL very well, but was supposed to be a really good player, and that's a Kadarius Toney. I've seen a lot of comps to him, but saying a more polished version of Kadarius Toney, which I think is what you probably want to focus on that side a little bit more. Do you see any similarities in that at all?
Yeah, I think I could, and I think the polish point is a good one. There's never been concerns with Luther's hands or anything like that. I think the one concern I've seen with him has been the route running, and I always I don't have the football acumen to evaluate college wide receivers on this route running sometimes, because it's so difficult when you have someone who has the athletic talent of Luther Burden going against these college wide receivers. Luther Burden could probably run a C+ route against a college wide receiver and get open. Yeah. Right. And so it can be hard to gauge that sometimes. But so I can see that a little bit. But I do think the polish point is an important one. Aside from the route running, I'd expect him to be looking very polished in most facets of his game.
Yeah, one of the things that I think a lot of people are going to talk about, we're going to talk about the touches and how much he gets the ball, how well he'll handle that, how well being that guy who was kind of the number one guy, like you said, for a couple years. Then last year, seeing regression when he wasn't getting the ball, now coming into a pretty packed room, but a young room. Rome Odunze's young, Colston Loveland's young, Cole Kmet's young. There's a lot of youngness in this room. How well do you think he'll mesh with some of these guys? It seems so far from rookie mini camp that we've seen that they're having a blast. It looks like the wide receiver room's having a great time. How well do you think he'll handle that and kind of this transition into the NFL with the packed room?
I think that's the question with Luther Burden. I really think it is, because the last 2 years he's been the guy at Missouri. Now, his last season at Mizzou, he wasn't the leading wide receiver in terms of yards or catches, but he was still the offensive focal point. He was getting that attention, both in terms of from his own team in his own locker room and from opponents as well. So that's going to be a departure when he's at it. You can tell me if he's even the 3rd or 4th highest target in the, like, there's a chance he's number 5, right? There really is, depending how this goes. So that's what is going to have to be the adjustment for him, is going from being a star in high school, a star in college, to now number 4 or 5 in the pecking order. Some players handle that well, some don't. Yeah. I think it's been clear for him that he'd have to make that adjustment once he slid out of the top 10. Yeah. If you're not going in the top 10, 15, it's hard for you to waltz in and be a wide receiver 1 from the start. Now, this is maybe a little more crowded than he was expecting, but it's the reality of it. If he's going to make it in this league, he's going to have to rise up and start from somewhere in there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people honestly are talking about that DJ Moore contract. I believe goes until 20. I think they have it out after 2027. So some Bears fans are wondering if this is kind of that transition period. Get Luther in here, give him a year or two, and then at that time, I love DJ Moore, but DJ Moore, if you're talking about you can have two young wide receivers and Luther Burden and Rome Odunze, you'd probably choose that for your future. But we will see how that all pans out. It's funny when you talk about that slide. He made a comment at his first press conference during this rookie mini camp, and he was saying that they asked him how he felt about falling to day 2, and he said that was going to stick with him forever. That fall was going to stick with him forever, and he also said he's going to remember every team that passed up on him in the first round, which is something someone like Enamon Ra also, he can list every single wide receiver that was drafted before him. Is that the kind of personality you see Luther Burden having, being able to be like that type of guy, kind of hold that at like a little bit of a higher standard there?
Oh, absolutely. He'll take that, he'll take that personally to the degree that I think he needs to for fuel. That's been something that this Missouri team has done for the last couple of years, and Luther's been a part of that. He's someone who I know the Bears picked up on this with their social media, but whenever he feels snubbed, he'll tweet "Okay, cool" on Twitter out there. After he slid out of the first round, he was back in the team facility that night working out. He's someone who is motivated by that, which I think is true of a lot of players in this day and age. But Luther, absolutely, I'm sure will bear that in mind.
Bear. I haven't seen the okay, cool, but I like that because I feel like that's a very me thing. Like I'm kind of passive aggressive. So I'm like, all right, that's cool. Like we'll figure it out. So I could see shirts being made eventually of the okay, cool. That's really funny. All right, Eli. Well, I really appreciate your time. I know Bears fans are super excited about Luther Burden. I knew a lot of people as I was doing my draft prep, and a lot of people had Luther as one of their top receivers, like a top 1, 2, or 3 receiver in this draft. So when his name was announced, it was a little bit of a surprise because I think most people thought they were going to go trenches in some form, and then they went wide receiver. And so it was a little bit of a surprise after also drafting a tight end in the first round. But I think that when somebody like that, the talent that you could project him to be able to be in that ceiling he has, I feel like it's a steal for the Bears, and they could be talking about that in a couple years. So I really appreciate you chatting a little bit with me, and I hope everything continues because it really was fun to watch a fun Missouri team that year when it happened. I live in Florida, so it's like all Gator fans, and I love when the Gators lose because I get a little bit of extra like fun when I get into work.
Hey, there you go. There you go. Yeah, we'll see what Mizzou can do this year. It's going to be a lot of reloading with a lot of guys off to the NFL.
Yeah. All right, Eli. Well, thank you so much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for having me on.